So in 1974, there was this political scientist named John Grove, and he looked at data across, I think it was 113 different nations.
Right, a massive sample size.
Yeah, massive.
Yeah.
And he found something that just completely shattered standard sociological assumptions about, how human beings react to oppression.
It really is wild.
It is. He basically discovered that highly diverse, racially stratified societies, so places with just massive systemic inequality, they actually experience significantly less sustained political violence than their more egalitarian peers.
Which completely breaks the intuitive model of revolution, right? I mean, you would assume that extreme inequality acts as this, powder keg.
Right, exactly.
You'd think it inevitably leads to sustained civil war, these massive uprisings. But the data showed the exact opposite. And the peace in those societies, well, it wasn't born of harmony. It was born of profound systemic exhaustion.
Wow, exhaustion.
Yeah. The oppressed groups were kept so systematically deprived of capital, education, and, institutional leverage that they literally could not afford to wage a war for their own freedom.
I mean, it's a grim, hidden architecture of human society. And that is exactly what we are dismantling today. So welcome to this deep dive into the Social Fabric Unraveled, which is created and produced by Adam Crenshaw.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, it's a heavy one. Today, we are moving past the optimistic myths of how societies supposedly blend together, and we are looking at the brutal, calculated mechanics of how they are actually engineered to fracture.
And engineered is the right word for it.
Totally. So for you listening at home, we're pulling from a few key sources today. We've got the university lecture materials of Dr. Edward Opoku-Dapa on race and culture. We have Martin Martyr's foundational textbook on ethnic relations. And of course, that shocking 1974 cross-national study by John Grove that we just mentioned.
And our analytical roadmap today, it basically revolves around contrasting two fundamentally opposed ways that sociologists map human interaction.
Right.
So first, we have the assimilation or order theories. These are the traditional models assuming a natural gravitational pull towards societal unity.
The melting pot stuff.
Exactly. And then we pivot to power conflict theories, which argue that racial and economic inequality are not glitches in the system. They literally are the system.
Right. And just as a quick heads up for you listening, you're going to hear us dissect Marxism, colonialism, systemic racism, and the mechanics of extreme violence today.
It gets intense.
It does. But we aren't here to champion a political ticket or, tell you who to vote for. We are just putting on the sociologist's lab coat to examine how these theoretical frameworks map human behavior.
The goal is just to hand you the blueprints so you can decode the structural engineering of the world around you.
Exactly. So, to understand why society fractures under conflict theory, I think we first have to understand the baseline assumption of how early sociologists believed it would unify.
Right, the assimilationist order perspective, which, dominated early 20th century sociology.
Right.
And it operates on this functionalist premise that society is basically a biological organism. And like any organism, it naturally seeks equilibrium.
Right, a state of balance.
Yeah. So in this view, minority groups entering a host society will inevitably undergo this orderly adaptation process, gradually shedding their distinct cultural identities to be absorbed into the dominant mainstream.
But Dr. Opoku-Dapa's lectures and the Marger text make it pretty clear that assimilation isn't just one monolithic thing, right?
Not at all.
It's actually categorized into three highly distinct societal goals. And the first one is Anglo-conformity, which has arguably been the historical engine of the United States.
Oh, absolutely.
And this isn't a blending process, right? It is an erasure process. The minority group is basically expected to completely abandon their ancestral language, their values, their norms, and just adopt the culture of the dominant group, which historically in the U.S. was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core.
Right. And the mechanics of Anglo-conformity, they are often legally and socially enforced, heavily.
Yeah, it wasn't just a polite suggestion.
No, not at all. Think of the intense Americanization movements of the early 1900s. Immigrant children were strictly forbidden from speaking their native languages in public schools.
Wow.
Or think about Henry Ford. He actually mandated that his immigrant workers attend these English melting pot schools.
Oh, right. The Ford English School. This part is wild.
It is. They literally had this graduation ceremony where workers in their traditional dress would walk into a giant physical prop cauldron and then emerge on the other side wearing American suits and holding little American flags.
I mean, you can't get a more on-the-nose metaphor than that.
literally stepping into a pot. But notice what happens there. The dominant culture remains completely unchanged while the subordinate culture is systematically dismantled.
Right, the cauldron doesn't change color. Which brings us to that second model, the one, everyone learns in elementary school. The melting pot.
Ah, yes, the famous melting pot.
Yeah, this implies a biological and cultural fusion where every group, including the dominant one, surrenders their heritage into a shared cauldron to forge a brand new hybrid alloy.
Right, a true blend.
Yeah, so there is no more dominant group, just a new unified people.
Mm-hmm.
But sociologists, practically laugh this out of the room as a historical reality.
Yeah, it's totally a myth.
It's a very comforting myth, sure.
Mm.
But structurally, dominant groups do not voluntarily surrender their cultural hegemony just because new people arrive. They just don't.
Precisely, because power structures are inherently conservative. They protect themselves. And that theoretical failure leads us to the third model, which is cultural pluralism or multiculturalism. So if Anglo-conformity is cultural erasure and the melting pot is a myth, cultural pluralism is the attempt at structural coexistence.
So keeping your identity.
Exactly. Minority groups maintain their distinct ethnic identities, so their religious practices, speaking their native languages at home, cultural traditions, but they fully integrate into the overarching secondary institutions of the society, like the political system, the economy, and the legal framework.
Right, and the classic textbook comparison here is Canada. You have the English and French charter groups operating alongside massive immigrant populations, and they're all under a framework that theoretically encourages maintaining cultural distinctiveness while sharing a national identity.
The whole mosaic idea.
Yeah, the metaphor usually thrown around as a salad bowl.
But I honestly think a better analogy is a massive, multi-tenant corporate office building.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, because think about it. Every company on every floor has a completely different corporate culture, dress code, internal language. But they all share the same HVAC system, the same elevators, and they pay rent to the same landlord. That is a much more accurate mechanistic view, I think, because it acknowledges the shared infrastructure without assuming intimate cultural blending.
Exactly.
But, to actually measure if any form of assimilation is happening, we have to look at the work of sociologist Milton Gordon. Because Gordon realized that the term assimilation was just too broad.
Too messy.
Yeah, so he surgically deconstructed it into 7 distinct stages. And he argued that one specific stage acts as the absolute bottleneck for societal integration.
So let's unpack that, because he starts with cultural assimilation,
Yeah.
or acculturation.
Right, that's stage 1.
And this is the baseline. You learn the language, you eat the food, you understand the political system. You essentially adopt the external markers of the dominant group.
But Gordon theorized that cultural assimilation can occur indefinitely without any further integration. Like, a minority group can become entirely acculturated, speaking perfect English, holding the exact same civic values, and still remain entirely segregated from the dominant group's inner circles.
Because Gordon basically argues that societal integration is like trying to join a highly exclusive legacy country club.
Yes, perfect analogy.
So cultural assimilation means you drove to the pro shop, you bought the exact right brand of golf clubs, you learned all the insider terminology, and you were standing on the porch in the required Argyle sweater.
You look the part.
You look the part, you act the part. But until the membership committee actually unlocks the heavy mahogany doors and allows you to walk into the clubhouse to drink and dine with the legacy members, none of that cultural adaptation actually grants you power.
And that unlocking of the doors is what Gordon defined as structural assimilation.
The bottleneck.
Exactly. It is the large-scale entrance of minority group members into the cliques, clubs, and primary institutions of the dominant group at a primary intimate level.
So not just surface level stuff.
Right. It's not just working in the same factory. It's being invited to the same dinner parties, joining the same private boards, living in the same gated neighborhoods.
Like the stuff that really matters for social mobility.
Yes. Gordon posited that structural assimilation is the keystone. If the dominant group refuses to unlock those doors, the whole process stops dead.
Wow.
But if they do unlock them, all the subsequent stages inevitably follow. Things like marital assimilation, which is widespread intermarriage, and identificational assimilation, where the minority group feels a true shared sense of peoplehood with the host society.
So if you're listening, you might be thinking, well, what dictates who gets the key to the clubhouse?
Right.
And Marger's textbook outlines several massive variables here. The most obvious is time. right? The generational gap is huge.
Oh, definitely.
First-generation immigrants are essentially in survival mode. They often retreat into ethnic enclaves for mutual aid and protection, and they're highly acculturated to their origin country.
That makes sense.
But the second generation is the crucible. They are caught in its psychological tug-of-war between the traditional culture of their parents and the dominant culture they're bombarded with at school and in media.
And then by the third generation, assuming the structural doors aren't barred by racial prejudice, the ethnic identity often becomes symbolic rather than structural.
Like celebrating a holiday but not living the day-to-day culture.
Exactly. But Gordon introduced a vital concept that complicates this whole timeline, which he called eth-class. He argued that you cannot analyze a group's assimilation trajectory based on ethnicity alone. You have to cross-reference it with their socioeconomic class.
Oh, I mean, that is huge. Because a wealthy, highly educated immigrant from Nigeria is going to have a vastly different, often accelerated path to structural integration than an impoverished immigrant from the exact same region.
Completely different trajectories.
Yeah, capital is the great social solvent. It buys access to the neighborhoods and educational institutions where structural assimilation actually happens.
Furthermore, the texts point out the gendered nature of this process. In groups arriving from heavily patriarchal societies, male immigrants often entered the broader workforce, which forced a rapid, if brutal, cultural assimilation.
Right, they had to adapt to survive the workplace.
Yeah. But women, conversely, were frequently restricted to the domestic sphere, or they were hypersegregated doing piecework in garment factories. This effectively isolated them from the primary institutions of the host society, severely delaying their structural integration.
We also have to consider intent. Are the immigrants sojourners? Meaning, did they come as temporary labor, intending to hoard capital and return to their home country?
Right, their goal isn't to stay.
Exactly. If you view your presence as temporary, you have zero incentive to structurally assimilate. You don't want to join the country club, you just want to mow the greens, collect your paycheck, and go home.
Exactly.
But compare that to political refugees who have had their passports revoked and their homes burned down. Their motivation to integrate is total, because there is literally no alternative.
But despite Gordon's elegant modeling of all these variables, there is a glaring, fatal flaw in the entire assimilationist framework. And this is what the critical sociologists leap upon.
Right, the blind spot.
Yes. Order theories fundamentally operate on an ethnocentric bias. They assume that the dominant culture is inherently superior, highly desirable, and that minority groups actively want to discard their heritage to join it.
It frames integration as a benevolent upgrade.
Yes.
It completely ignores the fact that many minority groups view the demand to abandon their language and customs as a hostile act of cultural violence.
And more importantly, assimilation theory completely breaks down when it encounters deliberate systemic exclusion.
Right.
What happens when a minority group successfully acculturates, achieves the necessary capital, puts on the Argyle sweater, and stands at the clubhouse door, only for the dominant group to change the locks based on an unalterable characteristic like skin color?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Order theories just cannot explain a society that intentionally refuses to unify.
Which means we have to completely abandon the premise of the melting pot here and cross the threshold into power conflict theory.
It's time to go there.
If assimilation is the study of how groups blend, conflict theory is the study of how dominant groups engineer societal structures to hoard resources and extract labor from subordinate groups.
Exactly. And the foundational premise of all power conflict theories, which draws heavily from Marxist roots but expands significantly to account for race, is that social inequality is a deliberate historical construction.
It's not an accident.
No, it is not an accident of poor assimilation. The social fabric is fractured by design. The dominant group establishes its hegemony and then utilizes the state's legal, economic, and physical power to ensure that subordinate groups can never challenge their monopoly on resources.
And the sources outline 3 specific manifestations of this conflict. So let's start with the most extreme, the most absolute form of exclusion, which is genocide.
Right.
When a dominant group encounters a subordinate group and determines that they want the resources the subordinate group occupies, but they have zero need for their labor, and they view them as fundamentally incompatible or dangerous. They deploy systemic extermination.
And from a sociological standpoint,
Permission slip. Wow.
yeah, because once the subordinate group is framed as an obstacle to progress or civilization, the dominant group feels morally justified in utilizing direct military killing. The intentional destruction of food sources like the systemic slaughter of the buffalo and the forced removal of populations to seize the desired capital.
Genocide is basically the ultimate anti-assimilation strategy.
Exactly.
It ensures that the dominant group's hegemony is absolute by entirely removing the variable of the subordinate group. But wait, I mean, if you are a dominant power looking to build a massive economic engine, genocide has a massive practical limitation.
Right, a huge one.
If you eradicate the local population to take their land, you have just eliminated your primary labor force. Who's going to chop the timber, mine the silver, and harvest the cash crops?
Exactly. If the dominant group shifts its priority from merely acquiring land to extracting labor to make that land profitable, well, genocide is counterproductive. You need the subordinate group alive. But you also need to ensure they can never rise up, demand equal wages, or challenge your political power. So you have this massive security dilemma, right? How do you physically and psychologically control a massive exploited labor force without fighting a continuous, exhausting war?
You build a cage.
Yeah.
You build a cage so comprehensive that the subordinate group polices itself. And that brings us to the second power conflict framework, which is caste theory.
Yes. A caste system is the most rigid, immutable form of social stratification human beings have ever devised.
It's locked down.
Totally. It is a closed system with absolute boundaries. First, status is entirely determined by birth, and it is permanent. There is no amount of wealth you can accumulate, no educational degree you can earn that will ever change your caste.
Wow.
Second, the system rigidly enforces endogamy, which is strict in-group marriage. It is a biological quarantine designed to prevent wealth and status from bleeding across caste lines through inheritance.
Right, keep the wealth at the top.
Exactly. And third, your caste dictates your occupational limits, your physical mobility, and your social associations.
And the texts apply this directly to the African American experience in the United States, charting how the dominant group engineered and continually updated this social cage across three distinct historical eras.
Let's walk through those.
Yeah, the first era obviously is chattel slavery. Conflict theorists view this not just as an economic labor model, but as a perfectly realized caste system. It utilized immense physical violence and intense racial ideology to create a powerless, permanent subordinate class whose biological reproduction literally generated more capital for the dominant group.
It's horrific, but the critical analysis really sharpens when we look at the second era, which is the post-Civil War period.
Right, Reconstruction and beyond.
Yeah. The formal institution of slavery was destroyed. The dominant group lost their legal mechanism of total control. So did assimilation begin.
Not even close.
Absolutely not. The dominant group simply re-engineered the cage. They utilized the state and local governments to construct the architecture of Jim Crow.
This is where we see the transition from de facto control to hyper-specific legal control. They instituted laws totally prohibiting intermarriage, legally enforcing endogamy. But the most insidious mechanism the sources highlight is the doctrine of separate but equal, specifically regarding education.
And educational segregation was a masterstroke of systemic labor manipulation.
How so?
Well, by forcing black and white children into different systems and then systematically starving the black educational system of funding, materials, and infrastructure, the dominant group guaranteed an uneducated, easily exploitable labor pool for the next generation.
Wow, yeah.
It was a literal educational caste system. The dominant group didn't need to force you to pick cotton or work in a dangerous foundry if they legally ensured you could never acquire the literacy or technical skills to compete for any other job. The market did the work of the overseer.
Market did the work of the overseer. That's a chilling phrase.
Right.
And that leads directly into the third era, which is contemporary America. The formal legal structures of Jim Crow were dismantled by the civil rights movement. But conflict theorists argue that the ghost of the caste system still dictates the social organization. The formal laws are gone, but the persistent prejudice, the generational wealth gaps, and deeply embedded institutional discrimination maintain the exact same boundaries.
Here, however, we encounter a significant theoretical friction within the sociological community.
What's that?
Marger's text explicitly points out a flaw in applying caste theory to modern America because structurally and legally, the United States is a class society, not a caste society.
Right. If you're listening, you might be thinking, wait, how can it be a caste system if there are zero laws preventing someone from starting a business, moving to a new state, or marrying whoever they want? And that is a totally valid critique.
It is. In a true caste system, like historical iterations in India, the restrictions are formalized, they're often religious, and they are absolute. The state explicitly forbids mobility. But in the contemporary U.S., social mobility is legally protected. A person from an impoverished, marginalized background can theoretically acquire massive wealth and political power.
Right. Let me reframe this for you, the listener, because it's a crucial distinction between how a system is written and how a system actually plays out.
Oh, I'm curious.
Think of the American economy like a massive, open-world, multiplayer video game.
Okay.
The terms of service, the legal manual, explicitly state that this is a class-based game. Any player, regardless of their starting stats, can grind, level up, and reach the final boss. That is the legal reality.
On paper, yeah?
Right, on paper. But what if the original game developers secretly hard-coded a massive invisible ceiling into the game's physics engine for certain players based on their avatar's race?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Yeah, so they spawn in zones with fewer resources, their loot drops are mathematically lower, and the aggressive non-player characters target them twice as often.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the sociological reality. The text basically states that although there are differences, the consequence is similar. In both caste and class society, social mobility is restrained.
Exactly.
You don't need a formal law dictating where a subordinate group can live if historical redlining has already segregated the neighborhoods. And the current banking algorithms deny their mortgage applications based on generational wealth deficits. It is technically a class system, but the economic inertia produces a de facto caste-like immobility.
So we have a dominant group utilizing de facto caste structures to hoard resources and extract cheap labor. But, how did this massive, incredibly complex economic machine get built in the first place? It requires astonishing coordination.
It really does.
We have to look at the role of the state, and that pivots us to the third power conflict framework, which is internal colonialism.
Right. And internal colonialism is a powerful analytical lens, primarily developed by sociologist Robert Bliner in the late 1960s. To really grasp it, we have to contrast it with traditional European imperialism.
Okay, the classic model.
Yeah, in the classic colonial model, a powerful nation-state, like Britain or France, crosses an ocean, conquers an indigenous population in a distant land, extracts the raw resources like rubber, gold, spices, and ships that wealth back to the motherland.
So the colonizers are essentially violent tourists. They build an extraction machine, but the locus of power remains thousands of miles away in Europe. But internal colonialism happens inside the house.
Exactly. The geographic separation completely vanishes. In internal colonialism, the control and exploitation of non-European subordinate groups passes directly into the hands of a white immigrant group within the newly established independent country. The colonizers don't go back to Europe. They sever ties with the motherland, they declare independence, and they build a new nation where they constitute the dominant core. And the colonized groups are marginalized within the exact same national borders.
And Blerner's model breaks down the historical mechanism of this into a pretty brutal sequence. Step 1 is the arrival of European settlers. Step 2, as we covered, is the genocidal campaigns against Native Americans to clear the board and seize the foundational capital, which is the land.
Right.
But step 3 is where the internal colonial machine is truly assembled, and that's the mass importation of unfree labor.
Yes. The dominant core had immense land, but massive labor shortages. Crucially, they could not rely on poor European immigrants for this extreme exploitation.
Right on.
Because poor Europeans could eventually blend into the dominant culture. They could structurally assimilate, right?
Right, going back to Gordon's stages.
Exactly. So they created a deeply segregated, biologically identifiable subordinate class. They imported enslaved Africans and subsequently heavily exploited Asian and Pacific peoples to build the transcontinental railroads and work the agricultural empires.
Right, the system needed a permanent underclass.
Yes. These groups were forcibly brought into the society not as prospective citizens, but as a permanent subordinate labor caste.
And then step 4 is the consolidation of political power. The non-European labor built the foundational wealth of the nation, but they received zero equity in the enterprise. All the massive economic benefits were reaped by the white agricultural and industrial capitalists.
And what conflict theorists emphasize here is the complicity of the central government. This wasn't a free market accident.
Right, it wasn't just a bunch of bad apples.
No, the state was not a passive observer, nor was this just the aggregate result of individual prejudiced citizens. The government was the chief architect of the internal colony.
I mean, the state literally provided the military force to clear the land, the judicial framework to write and enforce the slave codes, and the border policies to control the flow of imported labor.
Exactly. The central government actively established a legal and violent environment that legitimized the total economic exploitation of non-Europeans for the benefit of the dominant core.
Wow.
And this fundamentally shifts the sociological blame. It argues that contemporary inequality cannot be explained away by citing modern individual racism. Rather, current inequality is the mathematically predictable result of a state-sponsored economic machine designed centuries ago.
The system isn't broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function.
Precisely.
That is the raw, unvarnished core of conflict theory. It strips away all the mythology of the American dream and examines the cold mechanics of capital accumulation. But I mean, does internal colonialism explain every society?
That's a great question.
Because the Marger textbook provides a really important counterweight here. He points out that this theory has serious practical limitations when applied universally.
Yes, Marger cautions against using internal colonialism as a blanket explanation for all multi-ethnic societies. He draws a sharp distinction between colonial or segregationist societies like South Africa under the brutal apartheid regime, which was the ultimate textbook manifestation of an internal colony, and corporate pluralistic societies.
Right. And Switzerland is always the go-to example for corporate pluralism.
Yeah.
You have major distinct ethnic groups there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The German, French, and Italian populations.
Yes, very distinct groups.
They overlap in the exact same economy. They share the same national borders, but they aren't colonizing each other. They aren't trapped in a dominant and subordinate death spiral.
Right, and the reason for that is because the historical origins of their contact were entirely different. Internal colonialism really only accurately maps onto societies where the initial contact between groups was characterized by military conquest or involuntary forced migration.
The origin matters.
Greatly. It perfectly explains the structural violence of societies built on enslaved labor or conquered territory. But it falls apart when trying to explain states formed through the voluntary federated alliances of relatively equal powers.
Okay, so we've thoroughly mapped the American context and its historical roots using genocide, caste, and internal colonialism. But the real test of any sociological theory is its predictive power globally.
Right. How does it hold up everywhere else?
Does this dynamic of dominant extraction and subordinate suppression hold up across different cultures, different governments, and different continents? This is where we bring in the heavy artillery, which is John Grove's 1974 cross-national study.
Yeah, and Grove's work is a masterpiece of comparative political science because he didn't just look at a few Western nations, he analyzed empirical data from 113 different countries.
Just a massive undertaking.
Right. But before he could run his statistical models, Grove had to clarify a massive theoretical conflation that plagues both casual conversations and high-level sociology, and that is the absolute distinction between race and ethnicity.
Right, because we use those terms completely interchangeably in daily life. But Grove argues that treating them as the same thing completely destroys your ability to understand global political violence. They're fundamentally different variables.
Very different. According to Grove's operational definitions, ethnicity is an identity based on shared cultural values. It encompasses linguistic heritage, religious practices, dietary customs, and a shared historical narrative.
It's learned.
Yes, ethnicity is learned and transmitted culturally. Race, conversely, is a socially defined phenomenon that is forcefully assigned to groups based on perceived immutable physical traits, primarily skin color, but also facial structure and hair formation.
So you can theoretically change your ethnic markers, you can convert to a new religion, you can become perfectly fluent in a new language, you can adopt a new culture, but you cannot change the physical markers that a society uses to define race.
And Grove points out that traditional Marxist theory fundamentally failed to grasp this distinction, which blinded it to historical reality. Karl Marx viewed race as nothing more than a superficial variation of the class struggle.
A subcategory of class.
Right. He hypothesized that racial minorities were simply the most exploited lowest rung of the working class. So Marxist theory predicted that eventually the shared exploitation by the capitalist owners would cause the working class of all races to unite in a massive unified revolution against the bourgeoisie.
But Grove looks at the historical data and notes that Marx was just dead wrong. That universal working class solidarity almost never materialized.
Never really happened.
Why? Because the racial divide repeatedly proved vastly stronger and more violently enforced than the class divide.
Exactly. Grove points to the glaring historical reality that it was very often the workers of the dominant race who formed the vanguard demanding the most severe, violent discrimination against workers of the subordinate race. Yeah, when capitalist owners attempted to use black workers as strikebreakers or cheaper labor, the white working class didn't unite with them against the owner.
Yeah, they did the opposite.
They violently attacked the black workers, they formed segregated unions, and they demanded state laws to exclude them from the labor market entirely.
So the psychological wages of being part of the dominant racial group superseded the economic reality of being exploited by the capitalist class.
Bingo.
So Grove separates race and ethnicity into two distinct axes of analysis. And he runs the data on those 113 nations, analyzing two specific outcomes. One is economic inequality, and the other is sustained political violence, meaning, riots, armed rebellions, government crises, and civil wars. And his findings were, frankly, terrifying.
They completely subverted the standard theoretical expectations.
Right. Let's look at the first correlation. Grove found that ethnic pluralism, so nations comprised of multiple, diverse cultural and linguistic groups, showed a highly significant statistical correlation with sustained political violence and governmental instability.
Which makes intuitive sense, right? You have different cultures, different religions, different languages competing for control of the central government.
Yeah.
The friction leads to fire. But here is the massive twist in the data. Racial pluralism nations characterized by highly diverse racial groups did not significantly correlate with sustained political violence.
Let me just make sure you, the listener, are hearing the gravity of this. High ethnic diversity equals high political violence. High racial diversity equals extreme economic inequality, but low sustained political violence.
Right.
This seems entirely backward. If a dominant racial group is subjugating a minority racial group into extreme poverty, shouldn't that absolute inequality be the ultimate catalyst for a violent revolution? Why are the most deeply unequal racial societies experiencing less civil war than ethnically diverse ones?
And to understand the why, we have to synthesize Grove's data with the mechanics of internal colonialism and caste theory we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's connect the dots.
It all comes down to the distribution of resources. Grove hypothesized that ethnic minorities, even when facing severe discrimination by a central state, often maintain robust, parallel institutional resources.
Right.
They have their own geographical strongholds, their own religious hierarchies, their own unified linguistic networks, and often independent sources of capital.
So they have the organizational infrastructure and the financial leverage to actually negotiate with the dominant state, or if negotiations fail, to fund and sustain a prolonged political conflict. They can actually afford to fight.
Precisely. But racial minorities, particularly in societies structurally engineered by internal colonialism, have a completely different historical trajectory. They were brought into the system specifically to be a disenfranchised labor caste.
Right.
Because they have been systemically, legally, and violently deprived of wealth accumulation, educational access, and institutional power for generations, they fundamentally lack the macro-level political resources to mount and sustain an organized civil war.
Wait, I really want to underscore this point. Grove's data is suggesting that rigid racial stratification, like extreme poverty and segregation, actually prevents political violence because the minority is kept so economically devastated that they cannot physically construct the leverage required to threaten the state.
That is the grim empirical conclusion of the 1974 study.
That's heavy.
It is. Now, Grove notes that this doesn't mean these societies are entirely peaceful. There are absolutely sporadic, explosive outbursts of racial violence, urban riots, localized protests, desperate uprisings.
Right, obviously those happen.
But they do not coalesce into sustained, systemic civil wars that threaten to topple the government. Why? Because without access to massive economic capital and political infrastructure, these localized rebellions are easily, quickly, and overwhelmingly suppressed by the heavily resourced, militarized apparatus of the dominant government.
That completely upends how we define a stable society. We tend to view a lack of political violence as evidence of a functioning, just system. But Grove's data shows that a stable society might just be a flawlessly oppressive one.
Exactly.
If the state hoards 99% of the resources, the silence of the minority group isn't consent, and it isn't assimilation. It's just exhaustion. It's a mathematical lack of leverage.
It is a profoundly sobering realization. It mathematically demonstrates that racial stratification and economic deprivation are not just unfortunate byproducts of historical prejudice. They are highly effective, actively maintained economic weapons utilized by a dominant group to enforce the status quo and permanently insulate themselves from structural challenge.
Wow. We have covered a truly massive, complex landscape today. We started by dismantling the comforting myth of the smooth, orderly melting pot, recognizing that assimilation is often a rigged game where the dominant group controls the keys to the structural country club. We then waded into the dark mechanics of power conflict theories, examining how the ideological engine of genocide, the invisible architectural restraints of caste systems, and the state-sponsored extraction of internal colonialism were deliberately engineered to hoard wealth.
And we concluded by zooming out to a global perspective, utilizing Grove's cross-national data to prove that this isn't just an American phenomenon. It is a global pattern where racial stratification is systematically weaponized to strip minority groups of the resources necessary to even fight for their own liberation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, provocative mechanism to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today about resources, power, and the changing nature of the cage.
Yeah, consider this dynamic. If Grove's data fundamentally relies on the premise that racial groups are suppressed because they are kept economically poor, what happens to the social fabric of a modern society when a historically marginalized racial group finally begins to crack the code?
Oh, that's a fascinating question.
Right. What happens when, despite the de facto caste ceilings and the legacy of internal colonialism, that group begins to accumulate massive, undeniable economic and political capital? When they finally have the money, the institutional leverage, and the organizational power to threaten the dominant hegemony.
Right. Do the old invisible caste walls completely shatter under the sheer weight of that new economic reality? Does the society finally transition into true structural assimilation?
Yeah.
Or does the dominant group's instinct for self-preservation kick in, prompting them to invent an entirely new, even more insidious theoretical framework to keep the country club doors permanently closed?
That is the ultimate test of conflict theory and perhaps the defining sociological question of our time.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense structural analysis. We encourage you to take these blueprints and look closer at how the social fabric is woven and unraveling in your own communities. Until next time, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.